I'm going to start now by giving you that background about academic OSPOs, what they are and why we need them. And it's really in the context of the broader open source trends. So these will not be a surprise to many of you, but sometimes the details may be. So we know now that open source is everywhere. 96% of the world's software contains open source code. 77% of all code is actually open source. So this is not just a conversation for the open source community. It's a conversation for everyone involved in technology and software. Particularly in the context of open research, we know that open source software and hardware, but the idea of open source is a fundamental part of the broader conversation about open scholarship. And we know that there's a lot of challenges around open access and open data management. Sometimes we don't often get, sometimes particularly where there's lots of issues in the first two areas, we may not get to talk about open source. But to be honest, it's a fundamental part, and it's one area that we think is very important to cover. More importantly, recently there are a lot of reports coming out about the economic impact of open source. For years, everyone's known that that was the case. We're giving back to the economy in really important ways, but we're starting to see research that's actually quantifying that. So, for example, there has been a report put out, commissioned by the European Commission, which was talking about the actual contribution of open source to the EU's GDP. There are lots of new information coming out about the idea of commercial open source companies. This perception that open source is only for free and that no one makes money out of it is absolutely been debunked. And the most recent report about commercial open source companies are that they actually have, on average, 7 times greater valuations at IPO and 14 times greater values at merger and acquisition than their peers. They're getting funding faster and more funding. So, you know, these trends are things we all have to be cognizant of as we're thinking about how to drive economic impact at a national level. And then from social impact, I think a lot of folks that are in open source or involved in it have this idea that they're doing better in the world by making technology available that impacts us all so that everyone can access it, so people can trust it, so people can leverage it, and it can do better in the world. And this has been backed up by all the messaging we're getting from the United Nations and other NGOs who realize that we are at risk of a growing inequality in the world from a digital divide perspective, and it's so important to provide as much access and transparency as possible. So I also just want to mention about what's different about academic or university open source, because there is so much discussion that's happening in the general sphere around open source and so many challenges and promises and potential that people are talking about. But sometimes the discussion in the academic context differs slightly from that broader conversation. Sometimes our goals are different. I will use the example that, you know, from an open research perspective, people might be just publishing open source just as part of open research, but not necessarily to get huge contributions or anything like that. They're just doing it as part of their scholarly excellence. Students may not even want anyone to necessarily use their code. They're just doing it to practice the process of open source. So the goals of people involved in the academic open source ecosystem are sometimes different than those in the general ecosystem. The context is also different. I remember being on some, now that I know more about the academic space, I go along to some of the broader conversations. You hear people saying things like, we just have to tell the researchers they do this. And then anyone who's a researcher goes, ha, 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 ha. You can't tell researchers anything like that, right? So the context of an academic institution is very different. Corporations don't have libraries. Some of our best work we see coming out of libraries, but these are sorts of contextual differences that make the academic scenario different. And the profiles are different because we're not just talking about developers or software developers. So many people making huge impact to the academic space are not software developers at all. They may be coming from different domains, and they are making the changes that have most impact in the world, but we can't assume they know what Git is. We can't assume they understand the intricacies of licensing for open source, and we can't expect them to understand all that because they're busy doing other big brain stuff. So we do need to think about the different contexts that are related to open source in academia. And part of that challenge is what the open source program offices are trying to address. Because this isn't just about everyone figuring it out for themselves. This is about the idea of how do we support all of these efforts at an institutional level, and how do we actually increase the capacity of open source at scale. And that is what the academic open source are all about. There are many definitions of what an open source program office is, but they're generally around the same thing of being a center of competence. I think from an academic perspective, I should say that this has been a well-established trend in the corporate world now. Almost every large organization has an open source program office, and they have efforts, even if it's not called that, they have efforts to professionalize and institutionalize best practices around open source. But for us, an academic one is basically defined, and this is the work that was done by our OSPO definition working group in CURIOSS. It can be defined as an organizational construct that acts as a convener, community steward, and center of competency for open source. And this is the work that we're trying to do. And we're learning about how to do it in as much as we're doing it. So the work in CURIOSS is kind of meta at that level. So why would you have an academic OSPO? Well, this is just a graphic from some work that the Lero OSPO was involved in a number of years ago. It was funded by the National Open Research Forum in Ireland. And we were looking at the various different things to think about when we're justifying the reason for why we would focus on open source. And this was the summary they came up with. You know, sometimes you just need to know what's going on in your institution. Vast majority of academic institutions are not even aware of the amount of impact the folks associated with their institutions are having, nor are they aware of potential risk or institutional reputation that might be associated with doing it really badly. Now, most people are not necessarily in that space, but you also just want to be aware of that. And then really the whole point is about optimizing research impact for both economic and social impact, because that is one of the core goals of many academic institutions. And in the context of all that, you want to be able to have somewhere that's bringing in the technology trends and understanding what's latest is happening in the industry and other places. You want to know what regulations and policies are going to impact the researchers that are currently working on this. You need to know about what students and researchers are actually doing. I'll give you an interesting stat. I was at a meeting with some of the French open research folks, and Software Heritage did a survey about all the French university repositories in France. 70% of them had no open source license attached to their open source repositories. So, I mean, you know, just understanding what people are doing and what they should be doing in the gap, that's interesting. And there's opportunities for industry collaboration, and we'll hear more about what's happening in those sorts of collaborations later today. So these are the kinds of things that academic OSPOs get involved in. Broad open source excellence, often related to license guidance, but sometimes just the best practices in a university context in terms of research of individual researchers. Making sure that we think about research impact in the context of commercialization or technology transfer, but also in that broader social impact perspective. The idea of skills and education, supporting open source skills in the curricula that might exist, but also, and most importantly these days, the idea of providing practical experiences where they may not be available anymore in the because of the current climate. So the idea of actually being able to support that those practical skills, as well as just having courseware, is so important. And indeed, our OSPOs, we always have to put this in. We do have to actually take care of ourselves in terms of actually understanding what the operations are, tools and infrastructure, and doing outreach as well. So these are some of the things that OSPOs are involved in. There's actually an excellent, very small link down here, but we will send these slides around. There's an excellent work done around the definition of academic OSPO by another working group in CURIOSS, and that's available on Zenodo and on our website. And these are all the things that folks are involved in. But let's just have a look at CURIOSS itself. So CURIOSS was actually formally founded in 2023, thanks to a generous grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which we're very grateful for. But before that, we actually existed in another form as OSPO++, because at that point, some of the organizers of CURIOSS were involved in the broader mission of open source program offices in public sector. At that time, the Sloan Foundation also supported a number of US institutions to form an OSPO as part of an experiment to see how could they drive open source capacity in academia. We also were very lucky here to actually have two institutions in Ireland join that trend. So Trinity, as being the first academic OSPO in Europe, and Lero, which I'm also part of in another hat that I wear. But these institutions, Lero, for those of you who don't know, is the Software Development Research Centre of Ireland, so it spans a number of universities. You all know Trinity because you're here. But they also joined the community at that time. A second wave of institutions that were supported by Sloan came in 2023, In 2024, we had a network of universities join in the UC system, but also started to see more universities come in who were organically forming OSPOs based on the fact that they were already doing the work, just hadn't called it an OSPO sometimes, and sometimes doing new work as well. And then in 2025, we've had more of those join. And we see a pipeline of more institutions being interested in this to not only highlight the work they're already doing, but provide a signpost for people who are looking for that competency within an academic institution. Right now, we have 70 plus individual members from about 30 organizations. These are just some of the organizations, though I didn't check my count of the logo slide. But no two OSPOs are the same, and this is something that we always emphasize. When we think about the profile of those organizations, and I showed you that wheel of activities, not all OSPOs do all the activities. And they're often contextually aligned to where they sit in the organization. So they may sit in a library, they may sit in a research center, a center of excellence, in the IT department, in the comp sci department, in technology transfer office, in research software engineering groups. And depending on where the OSPO is located, they may have different competencies and different focuses and goals. So our goals are to have the dedicated spaces to share and adapt. These are some of the outputs that we would have that folks can engage with. For example, we have a patterns practice where we cover a lot of what's going on in terms of trying to describe the individual activities that the OSPOs do. And we hear it's very useful for people coming new to the game. We have a resources list. We have over 300 resources that are being curated by CURIOSS members and tagged as to how they appeal or are relevant to the academic OSPO perspective. And we have a number of deep dives and community calls that we also make available to people. These are all the public ones. So for example, if you look at the resource list, you might see these sorts of licensing resources that have been curated by CURIOSS members, or the ones created by CURIOSS members. So you can filter by that. And indeed, we have these patterns. We have about 35 patterns, but they're linked to particular areas of impact. And you can, we're growing that number all the time. And we have these deep dives where you can actually hear more about the information that we find is contextually interesting. So lastly, I would just say that, well, a rose by any other name smells as sweet. Really, we also realized that many people may not have the actual term OSPO in their name, but they're doing the work. And we welcome folks that are doing the work. We ask that it is a signal, not of volunteer work, but of institutionally supported work that's happening. But once that is the case, we would welcome you to the community. And there are reasons, though, why you might want to be called an OSPO. I just want to say that, for the feedback we've gotten back is that it does demonstrate a clarity of purpose and focus, and helps us understand the changing landscape that we work in. It does mean that it's aligned with the ecosystem word of an OSPO. So if you have a corporate partner, for example, who has an OSPO, looking for their counterpart in your organization, they may also look for the OSPO rep. So that's just making sure that it's aligned with this idea of enabling global collaborations and even with the other institutions. It does mean that both internally and externally, we're trying to promote the idea that this is something that folks actually search for and look for when they're trying to find where the OSPO is or the open source support is available in their university. And also then for us, it just means that it signals commitment specifically to open source. And that can often attract talent, actually, because people are interested in those academic institutions that are interested in social impact and are interested in building this particular set of competencies.